Say it again. The quiet voice would later become the sentence no billionaire could ever forget. But at that moment, no one in the Grand Meridian Hotel expected a single foreign word to change the direction of an entire evening. Crystal chandeliers washed the private dining room in warm golden light, while a jazz trio played softly beneath the steady murmur of investors, executives, and international guests celebrating what the business press had already labeled the deal of the year. Waiters moved with practiced precision between tables dressed in white linen, polished silver, and handcrafted glassware worth more than some families earned in a month. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Every handshake carried a price. At the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, the 38-year-old billionaire founder of Caldwell Dynamics, a man whose confidence often arrived several seconds before he did. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, his custom watch caught every flicker of light, and his reputation for winning impossible negotiations had made younger entrepreneurs treat him like royalty. Ethan believed the world belonged to those willing to take it, and over the years, success had slowly convinced him that kindness was optional while power was permanent. Moving almost invisibly around the table was Naomi Brooks, a 26-year-old black waitress whose calm posture made balancing heavy serving trays appear effortless. She greeted every guest with the same quiet professionalism, remembered every special request without writing anything down, and carried herself with a dignity that expensive clothing could never imitate. Most people noticed her only when they needed another glass of sparkling water. Few wondered about the intelligence hidden behind her composed smile. Even fewer imagined she understood more than they assumed. Tonight was supposed to be routine. Finish the shift, collect her tips, and return home before midnight. Instead, history had quietly reserved another plan. Ethan barely looked at her as she refreshed the wine beside his chair. One careless movement from another guest caused a single drop to touch the white tablecloth. It was harmless, almost invisible, but Ethan leaned back with a smirk that invited laughter before he even spoke. Switching effortlessly into Korean, convinced no one serving the room could possibly understand him, he muttered one cold word. Gyujit. It. Not she. Not her. It. A dismissive label stripped of dignity, spoken with the casual arrogance of someone certain his audience existed only to entertain him. Two overseas executives exchanged uncomfortable smiles before one of them laughed anyway. Another lowered his eyes toward his plate. Naomi's hand paused for less than a heartbeat as she folded the linen napkin with perfect precision. Her expression never changed. She neither defended herself nor acknowledged the insult. She simply continued serving the table as though the word had dissolved into the music. Ethan mistook her silence for ignorance. What he could not see was a pair of dark eyes watching from across the room. A man seated alone in the exclusive VIP section had stopped his conversation the instant that single Korean word crossed the air. His fingers tightened slightly around the stem of his untouched wine glass. He did not interrupt. He did not react. He simply listened, every syllable settling into a silence far heavier than anyone at Ethan's table could possibly understand. Because unlike everyone else in that glittering room, he knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was. And he had heard every single word. 45 minutes earlier, the Grand Meridian Hotel had looked less like a restaurant and more like a carefully choreographed performance where every detail existed to remind its guests that influence had its own language. Valets welcomed imported luxury cars beneath towering marble columns, while photographers captured executives whose signatures could reshape industries before dessert. Inside, the ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected against polished black stone floors, filling the room with a warm glow that softened expensive suits but revealed every hidden expression. The scent of aged oak, fresh flowers, and perfectly prepared steak floated through the air as conversations drifted between billion-dollar acquisitions, international expansion, and the future of artificial intelligence. Naomi Brooks arrived through the employee entrance almost an hour before the first guests. Like every shift, she checked each table twice, memorized seating assignments, polished every wine glass until it reflected light without a single mark, and quietly greeted each coworker by name. She believed respect should never depend on job titles because the people the world overlooked were often carrying its greatest burdens. Few people knew that after finishing 12-hour shifts, she spent her evenings studying Korean language, literature, and history. It had started years ago from simple curiosity, but had gradually become something much more personal after meeting the man who would eventually ask her to marry him. Daniel Kong admired discipline more than attention, and Naomi admired the way he listened before speaking. Their relationship remained private by mutual choice because Daniel insisted that genuine love should never become public entertainment. Even the engagement ring resting beneath the sleeve of Naomi's uniform remained hidden throughout every shift. Across town, Daniel had arrived in the United States only that morning after concluding meetings in Seoul. Officially, he served as chairman of Kong Global Holdings, a multinational investment group with interests spanning technology, shipping, hospitality, and renewable energy. Business magazines praised his strategic brilliance, while competitors quietly admitted that negotiations usually ended exactly where Daniel intended. Rumors followed him wherever he traveled. Some described powerful political connections. Others whispered about a family history tied to influential organizations that had once operated in the shadows before transforming into legitimate global enterprises. Daniel never addressed speculation because he understood that mystery often discouraged questions more effectively than explanations. Tonight, he accepted an invitation from Korean investors considering a partnership with Ethan Caldwell's company. Rather than requesting special treatment, he asked for the most discreet table in the room where he could observe before introducing himself. He preferred learning about people through unguarded moments instead of polished presentations. Ethan, meanwhile, entered through the front lobby surrounded by assistants, legal advisors, and financial consultants whose schedules revolved around his own. Employees greeted him by name before he acknowledged them. Investors laughed a little louder when he spoke. Managers hurried to satisfy requests before he finished making them. Ethan enjoyed those reactions because they confirmed everything he believed about success. To him, influence was measured by how quickly other people adjusted their behavior. As the evening unfolded, no one realized that three separate stories were moving steadily toward the same collision. One belonged to a billionaire convinced that language could hide contempt. Another belonged to a waitress whose quiet composure concealed unexpected understanding. The last belonged to a man who had spent years mastering the discipline of remaining silent until the exact moment silence no longer served justice. The evening settled into an elegant rhythm that made the earlier insult seem almost invisible to everyone except the few who had truly understood it. Crystal glasses clinked softly while servers delivered each course with perfect timing, and conversations drifted effortlessly between investment strategies, overseas manufacturing, and emerging technology. Ethan Caldwell appeared completely relaxed, convinced that another successful negotiation was unfolding exactly as planned. Confidence had always rewarded him, and years of winning had quietly erased the habit of questioning himself. Every smile around the table reinforced the belief that he remained the most important person in the room. Naomi Brooks continued moving gracefully from one guest to another, refilling glasses, replacing silverware, and anticipating requests before anyone needed to speak. Her composure never cracked. Yet beneath that calm exterior, every Korean sentence Ethan had spoken remained perfectly clear in her mind. She understood every word, every tone, every layer of disrespect hidden behind a language he believed protected him from accountability. Long before she met Daniel Kong, Naomi had fallen in love with learning itself. She had borrowed Korean language books from public libraries, watched documentaries with handwritten notes beside her, practiced pronunciation during bus rides home after exhausting shifts, and refused to quit whenever difficult grammar made progress feel impossible. Daniel had never taught her because he believed knowledge earned through discipline became part of a person's character forever. Instead, he encouraged her curiosity, challenged her with novels instead of simple conversations, and smiled every time she surprised him with another phrase spoken naturally. That dedication had become one of the reasons he admired her most. She never learned to impress people. She learned because understanding another culture was, to her, another way of respecting another human being. Across the room, Daniel quietly observed everything without interrupting the flow of the evening. His business associates continued discussing market forecasts, but their attention had begun shifting toward him. They had noticed the subtle change in his expression after Ethan's earlier remark. Daniel remained remarkably composed, yet those who had negotiated beside him for years recognized the difference between patience and approval. One Korean executive carefully set down his coffee cup before speaking in a low voice. Daniel answered with only a brief nod, his eyes never leaving the dining room. There would be a time for conversation later. For now, he wanted to see what kind of man Ethan Caldwell truly was when he believed no consequences existed. Back at the main table, Ethan's confidence encouraged him to continue entertaining his guests. Between discussions about projected revenue and expansion into Asian markets, he occasionally slipped into Korean again, adding sarcastic comments that drew restrained laughter from two executives eager to remain in his favor. Naomi heard every sentence while carefully placing fresh bread onto the table. She chose silence once more, not because she lacked courage, but because dignity sometimes required extraordinary restraint. She believed that responding too quickly often allowed arrogance to control the story. The greatest truths revealed themselves when people were given enough freedom to expose their own character. Unaware that every careless word was quietly reshaping the opinions of influential people throughout the room, Ethan lifted his glass with another confident smile. He believed language had hidden his contempt. He had no idea it had simply expanded the audience capable of judging it. Dinner progressed with polished elegance, but beneath the polished conversation something almost invisible had begun to shift. The Korean delegation no longer laughed as freely at Ethan Caldwell's remarks. Their smiles had become measured, their questions more careful, their eyes quietly studying details they had ignored when the evening began. Successful negotiations were rarely decided by numbers alone. They were decided by trust, character, and the ability to respect people whose names would never appear on corporate letterhead. Ethan failed to notice the change because he remained convinced that charm and confidence could recover any moment. He leaned comfortably into his chair, speaking about market dominance, expansion across Asia, and the importance of understanding foreign business culture. The irony escaped him completely. Every sentence praised respect while his private comments revealed the opposite. Naomi Brooks approached with fresh coffee for the final course. Her movements remained steady despite the growing tension she could now feel spreading quietly across the room. She placed a porcelain cup beside one executive before gently asking whether anyone preferred decaffeinated coffee. Her English was warm and professional, exactly as every guest expected. Then one of the Korean investors thanked her in his native language without thinking. Naomi answered naturally, wishing him an enjoyable evening and recommending a traditional tea served by the hotel that reminded her of one she had enjoyed in Seoul months earlier. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it immediately drew several curious glances around the table. Ethan looked up briefly, surprised that she had responded so comfortably, yet he quickly dismissed it with a faint smile. Knowing a few polite phrases, he assumed, was hardly impressive. He returned to his presentation without another thought. What Ethan did not realize was that Naomi had not spoken like someone repeating memorized expressions. She had spoken with the relaxed rhythm of someone who genuinely understood the language. Across the dining room, Daniel Kong noticed every reaction. He saw the executives exchange silent looks. He noticed one investor slowly lowering his coffee cup before whispering something to another. He also noticed Naomi choosing not to reveal more than necessary. She could have answered Ethan's earlier insults immediately. She could have embarrassed him in front of every guest. Instead, she protected the dignity of the room even after her own dignity had been challenged. Daniel admired that restraint more than any dramatic confrontation. Real strength, he believed, was measured by what a person refused to do when given the opportunity. Ethan continued speaking, growing increasingly animated as projected revenue figures appeared on a nearby presentation screen. His confidence returned with every approving nod from his own advisors. Wanting another laugh, he switched back into Korean and quietly remarked that some people were excellent at carrying trays because thinking was clearly not their strongest talent. This time, no one laughed. The silence arrived so suddenly that even the soft jazz drifting from the ballroom seemed distant. Ethan glanced around the table, expecting amused expressions, but instead found lowered eyes and uncomfortable faces. He frowned, unable to understand why the atmosphere had cooled in only a few seconds. Naomi simply collected an empty dessert plate and walked away without looking back. Daniel slowly placed his napkin beside his untouched coffee, rose from his chair with calm, deliberate confidence, and began walking toward the center of the room, while every Korean executive instinctively followed him with their eyes. Daniel Kong crossed the ballroom without the slightest hint of urgency, yet every step seemed to slow the entire evening. Conversations faded one by one as guests instinctively followed him with their eyes, sensing that something important was unfolding even though no one understood exactly what it was. He did not demand attention. He simply carried the quiet confidence of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Naomi noticed him approaching before anyone else did. For the first time that evening, a gentle warmth appeared in her expression, subtle enough that only someone who truly knew her would recognize it. She offered the same professional smile she gave every guest, but Daniel saw the exhaustion hidden behind it. He also saw something else. She had chosen grace over pride every single time she had been tested that night. That choice mattered more to him than any public display of courage. Ethan Caldwell finally stood, assuming another influential investor had come to introduce himself before the closing negotiations. He extended his hand with polished confidence and the practiced smile that had helped him secure countless partnerships over the years. Daniel accepted the handshake politely, but did not release it immediately. Instead, he looked directly into Ethan's eyes with calm composure that felt strangely heavier than anger. Then, in clear and effortless Korean, he asked one simple question. "Did you truly believe no one here understood what you said?" The color slowly drained from Ethan's face. His confident smile hesitated for the first time that evening. Around the table, several Korean executives quietly exchanged glances but remained silent. Ethan answered in Korean almost automatically, attempting a light laugh as though the earlier remarks had merely been harmless jokes shared among acquaintances. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished speaking, Daniel replied in the same calm tone. Words spoken in another language do not become invisible. They simply reveal who believes they are beyond accountability. The silence surrounding them became impossible to ignore. Even guests seated several tables away sensed that the atmosphere had changed. Hotel employees instinctively paused their movements, careful not to disturb whatever was unfolding. Naomi remained beside the service station, neither stepping forward nor attempting to defend herself. She trusted Daniel, but more importantly, she trusted the truth. Daniel slowly turned toward her with unmistakable respect before looking back at Ethan. "The woman you referred to so carelessly is Naomi Brooks." He allowed a brief pause before continuing. "She is also the woman I asked to marry me." Several members of the Korean delegation quietly lowered their eyes, not out of embarrassment for Naomi, but because they understood the significance of Daniel's words. He had not introduced her by her profession. He had introduced her by her name. Ethan stared at Naomi as though seeing her for the very first time. Every assumption he had made only minutes earlier suddenly felt dangerously incomplete. Yet Daniel was not finished. His voice remained steady, free from hostility or threats. "She never answered your insults because she believes dignity does not need permission from arrogance. She understood every word you spoke. She simply chose to protect the peace of this room instead of protecting her pride." No one laughed. No one whispered. The ballroom stood perfectly still as the weight of that truth settled over every guest. Ethan finally realized that the negotiation he had spent months preparing for was no longer being judged by financial projections or market forecasts. It was being judged by the character he had revealed when he believed the people serving him were invisible. No one spoke for several long seconds because the truth had already said everything that needed to be said. Ethan Caldwell slowly withdrew his hand, his confident posture giving way to visible uncertainty. He searched the faces around the table, hoping someone would dismiss the moment with a polite laugh or an awkward smile, but none came. The Korean executives who had admired his business accomplishments only minutes earlier now regarded him with thoughtful silence. They had traveled thousands of miles to evaluate more than financial statements. They wanted to know the character of the man they might trust with decades of partnership. Numbers could be audited. Integrity could only be witnessed. Daniel Kong remained composed, his voice steady. Enough that every word carried through the elegant dining room without effort. "Business succeeds because people choose to trust one another," he said. The way we treat those who cannot benefit us often reveals how we will eventually treat those who can. His words contained no threats, no raised voice, and no attempt to embarrass Ethan. That restraint made them even more difficult to ignore. Naomi stood quietly beside the service station, resisting every temptation to step into the spotlight. She had never wanted revenge. She had only wanted to finish an honest day's work with the same dignity she brought into every shift. One of the senior Korean investors slowly rose from his chair and addressed Naomi in Korean, thanking her for her professionalism throughout the evening and apologizing that she had been placed in such an uncomfortable situation. Naomi answered with gentle humility, explaining that she believed respect was always worth protecting, even when it was not immediately returned. Her words surprised several American guests who had only moments earlier assumed she understood nothing beyond ordinary customer service. The room seemed to rediscover her all at once. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer simply the waitress carrying coffee and dessert. She was an educated, thoughtful woman whose quiet character had remained consistent while everyone else revealed their own. Ethan finally cleared his throat, attempting to recover control of the conversation. He admitted that his remarks had been inappropriate and insisted that he had never intended genuine harm. His apology sounded practiced, the kind often delivered after consequences become unavoidable. Daniel listened respectfully before answering with calm honesty. "Intent matters," he said, "but character matters more. The easiest time to show respect is before anyone is watching." Those words settled heavily over the gathering. Even Ethan's own advisors lowered their eyes, recognizing that no legal strategy or polished presentation could erase what every witness had experienced firsthand. The evening had quietly transformed from a negotiation into a lesson no executive education program could teach. Across the ballroom, conversations resumed in careful whispers, yet the atmosphere had permanently changed. The expensive chandeliers still sparkled, the musicians still played, and the beautifully prepared meal remained untouched on several plates. But the center of attention was no longer the billion-dollar proposal displayed on the presentation screen. It was the undeniable contrast between two kinds of power. One had relied on status, wealth, and influence. The other had relied on patience, humility, and unwavering dignity. As the final course was cleared from the table, every person in the room understood that the most important decision of the evening was no longer about signing a contract. It was about deciding whose character deserved their confidence. The chairman of the Korean delegation slowly closed the leather portfolio that contained the draft agreement everyone had expected to celebrate before the evening ended. The quiet sound echoed far louder than it should have, drawing every eye toward the conference table. Without announcing a decision, he exchanged measured glances with the executives seated beside him. Years of working together had taught them to understand one another without lengthy discussions. Trust was not rebuilt in a single conversation, and doubt rarely disappeared once it entered the room. Ethan Caldwell immediately sensed the shift. The confident momentum that had carried him through countless negotiations had vanished, replaced by a silence he could neither predict nor control. He took a careful breath and began outlining the financial advantages of the proposed partnership once again, pointing toward projected growth, international expansion, and long-term returns. His presentation remained polished, but something essential had disappeared. The room was no longer evaluating spreadsheets. It was evaluating judgment. One senior investor folded his hands and spoke with calm professionalism. He explained that every successful partnership depended on mutual respect because difficult moments always arrived eventually, and when they did, character determined whether cooperation survived. Another executive quietly agreed, adding that impressive numbers could create opportunity, but only integrity could sustain it. No accusation followed. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Their words remained courteous, making the message even more unmistakable. Daniel Kong listened without interruption, allowing the delegation to reach its own conclusions. He had no desire to influence their business decision through personal relationships or public pressure. If they continued the partnership, it had to be because they believed it was right. If they chose another path, that decision also had to belong entirely to them. Naomi watched from a respectful distance while helping another server clear dessert plates from nearby tables. Several hotel employees had begun whispering among themselves after recognizing that something extraordinary had happened, yet Naomi gently reminded a younger coworker to remain focused on the guests. Professionalism, she believed, should never disappear simply because emotions were running high. Her calm example quietly spread through the staff, restoring the smooth rhythm of service even as the executives continued their discussion. One of the Korean investors eventually stood and walked toward Naomi with a warm smile. In fluent Korean, he thanked her once more for representing grace under pressure and then switched to English so everyone nearby could understand. He said that true hospitality was not measured by luxury, but by the dignity shown to every person in the room. Several guests nodded in quiet agreement. Ethan heard every word. For perhaps the first time in many years, he understood that respect could not be purchased, negotiated, or demanded. It had to be earned through countless ordinary moments that no headline would ever record. The delegation finally gathered its documents, not in celebration but in thoughtful reflection. They explained that they would postpone signing any agreement until a later date because partnerships of such importance deserved careful consideration beyond financial performance alone. Their decision remained courteous and completely professional, yet its meaning was unmistakable. As they prepared to leave the ballroom, several executives paused to shake Naomi's hand before thanking the hotel staff for an exceptional evening. Ethan remained standing beside the untouched contract, watching the opportunity he had considered inevitable quietly walk toward the exit. In a room filled with extraordinary wealth, the most valuable lesson of the night had come from a woman whose greatest strength had never appeared on a business card, but had been visible in every choice she made. The ballroom slowly returned to its elegant routine, yet nothing about the evening felt ordinary anymore. The musicians continued playing, servers quietly cleared the remaining tables, and the chandeliers reflected the same warm light across polished marble floors, but every conversation carried a different tone. Guests who had arrived expecting to witness the announcement of a landmark international partnership instead found themselves discussing something far more memorable. They spoke about composure, humility, and the surprising power of a single moment that revealed more about leadership than hours of financial presentations ever could. Ethan Caldwell remained near the conference table long after the Korean delegation had stepped into the hotel lobby. His advisors cautiously approached with updated schedules and suggestions for reconnecting with the investors the following morning, but Ethan barely heard them. For the first time in years, no strategic plan could immediately repair what had happened. Reputation had always been one of his greatest assets, and he suddenly realized how fragile it truly was. Success had protected him from difficult self-reflection for so long that he had mistaken confidence for character. Meanwhile, Daniel Kong thanked the hotel management for hosting the event before quietly complimenting the professionalism of the entire service staff. He made no public speeches, requested no special recognition, and never mentioned his own influence. As he prepared to leave, several executives expressed admiration not for his business accomplishments, but for the restraint he had demonstrated throughout the evening. Daniel simply answered that respect should never become a performance. If it only appeared when cameras were present or powerful people were watching, then it was not respect at all. Naomi finished her final responsibilities exactly as she had every other night. She helped organize serving stations, thanked her co-workers for their teamwork, and carefully folded her apron before placing it inside her locker. A younger waitress quietly asked how she had remained so calm after everything that had happened. Naomi smiled gently before answering that anger often asks us to become the person who hurt us. Dignity asks something much harder. It asks us to remain ourselves. Those simple words stayed with everyone who heard them. Outside the hotel, the cool evening air replaced the warmth of the ballroom. Daniel waited beside the entrance, not because Naomi needed rescuing, but because they had planned to leave together long before anyone knew the night would become unforgettable. When she stepped outside, he greeted her with the same quiet smile he had worn when the evening began. There were no dramatic celebrations and no triumphant speeches. He simply asked whether she was ready to go home. She nodded, and together they walked toward the waiting car at an unhurried pace. Behind them, several members of the Korean delegation paused before entering their vehicles, watching the couple disappear into the city lights. One executive quietly remarked that they had just witnessed the difference between influence and greatness. Another replied that wealth could open doors, but only character determined who would still be standing when those doors finally closed. Back inside the nearly empty ballroom, Ethan looked around at the silent tables where he had expected applause only a few hours earlier. Everything expensive remained exactly where it had been, yet the room somehow felt completely different. He finally understood that the opportunity slipping away had not been caused by a failed negotiation. It had begun the moment he believed another human being deserved less respect simply because she was wearing a server's uniform. Several weeks passed before anyone inside the business world fully understood what had happened that evening at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The postponed agreement was eventually awarded to another company whose executives had impressed the Korean delegation with something far more valuable than ambitious projections. They demonstrated consistency, humility, and respect in every meeting, whether they were speaking with senior investors or welcoming the newest employee into the room. Industry publications speculated about changing market conditions, strategic priorities, and evolving international partnerships, but those who had attended the dinner already knew the real reason. Contracts were built with signatures, but lasting partnerships were built with character. Ethan Caldwell made no public statements about the event. Instead, he quietly began changing the way he led his company. He introduced leadership training focused on professional conduct, encouraged managers to spend time working alongside frontline employees, and established new standards emphasizing respect at every level of the organization. None of those decisions erased the past, nor did he expect them to. Trust was not restored through announcements. It returned only after countless ordinary choices proved that a lesson had truly been learned. Some people dismissed the changes as public relations. Others noticed that employees gradually began describing a different workplace, one where their voices carried greater value than before. Growth came slowly, just as genuine change always does. Naomi Brooks never sought recognition for what had happened. She continued working until she completed the final semester of her graduate program, carrying herself with the same quiet professionalism that had defined her long before anyone knew her story. The hotel manager later offered her a leadership position, explaining that technical skills could be taught, but calm integrity inspired entire teams. Naomi accepted with gratitude, not because the title made her more important, but because it allowed her to encourage young employees who sometimes felt invisible. She reminded them that every interaction mattered because people rarely remembered every word we spoke, but they almost always remembered how we made them feel. Daniel Kong remained exactly as he had always been. He continued leading his global companies with patience instead of spectacle and never mentioned the dinner during interviews or business conferences. When friends asked why he had remained so calm that night, he simply answered that dignity never becomes stronger by humiliating someone else. Justice reaches its highest purpose when it creates an opportunity for wisdom instead of revenge. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Daniel and Naomi returned to the same hotel, this time as ordinary guests sharing lunch by the window overlooking the city. Several employees recognized them and smiled warmly, remembering the evening that had changed so many perspectives without a single raised voice. Naomi thanked every server who visited their table, learned each person's name, and left with the same kindness she had always carried. Nothing about success had changed who she was because success had never been the source of her identity. As they walked into the afternoon sunlight, the city moved around them with its usual energy, unaware that one ordinary dinner had permanently altered the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. Wealth could command attention. Influence could shape decisions. Power could fill an entire room with silence. But none of those things could equal the quiet strength of a person who refused to surrender compassion when given every reason to do so. In the end, the richest soul in the room was never measured by the balance in a bank account, but by the respect freely offered to someone the world expected everyone else to overlook.